And welcome to your Ruby Live event. My name is Eric Wynkoop, and I'm the Director of Culinary Instruction, and I'm also one of your instructors in the courses that we offer. And today I want to give you a special welcome to my office hours, and this is your chance to ask food and cooking related questions, and it's my chance to do my best to respond to them. And, as we get started, I want to mention a couple of things. It's the usual housekeeping items. And the first one is if you would like to participate more directly in today's event, feel free to enter a question or a comment in the dialog box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And number two is as you look at the individual questions that are already populated in the queue, you will see a heart-shaped icon. And if you would like me to respond to that question sooner than later, you can click on that heart-shaped icon and it'll bump it up in priority. Okay, but otherwise I'll get to the questions. And without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. And the first one is from Afka, who says hello or hi. How do I increase the chance of success with new recipes? I try a lot of new recipes from cookbooks and Instagram, but 8 out of 10 are so-so. Do you have any tips or advice? This is a great question, and one that comes up in my world every once in a while, usually with clenched teeth and shaking a fist, because I'll start out with my first thought, and that is that, in the great world of media, it is very common, as you have discovered, 8 out of 10, that might have been my number I pulled out of my pocket too. Recipes are not well tested before being published. And you've noted cookbooks and Instagram, absolutely. So it's not just a social media thing. It is for hard printed items as well, magazines and books. And so, number one, that's the environment in which we live. So I'll share a couple of thoughts. One is that at Ruby, as you move through your course, our goal, our mutual goal, your end goal is to come to understand the cooking methods and supporting techniques at a deeper level, so that when you read through a recipe, you can better understand it. Okay. And through your experience with ingredients, whatever it is, whether it's a bell pepper or some herbs and spices that you've never used before, but we got to start somewhere, right? So as we accumulate experience, you will have, again, more control over the recipe. So the goal is to get you to a point where you're not you're not controlled by the recipe, right? You're not forced to just follow the recipe blindly, but rather, you have some input because you have greater understanding of the variables that go into this cooking process. And, to some extent, that even holds true with recipes and cuisines that you might not, be proficient in. Okay. I will say that certainly as we explore global cuisines, there are methods and techniques that are specific, right, to that regional cuisine, and they fall outside of the core or common, at least in the global mainstream, set of cooking methods and techniques that we offer in our courses. So, there's always a little learning curve that needs to be dealt with. Okay. But, as I approach a recipe, generally, I'm curious as to what the author intended. And so my first time out, I will try to follow it according to the way it's written. I'm just curious, to see this particular author's interpretation of a dish. And then from there on out, it's up to me to make changes to better suit the equipment in my kitchen, and the nuances of palate preference, right, for the audience that I'm cooking for. And so, you have that opportunity as well, of course. Um, so, when you're cooking a recipe for the first time, it can be a little difficult to nail precisely because of these variables that are at play, whether that's going to be ingredient quality, the type of equipment and tools that you have versus what the author was using when he or she wrote the recipe. The time of year can make a difference, again, based upon the produce available, the varieties, the quality. So, the first time out can be a little bit rough. But once you get through that, then you've got control and you have the permission to make changes to that recipe. It becomes a little more challenging in baking, right? Because baking, we should be dealing with formulas versus recipes. And a formula is a term that we use in the baking world for a recipe, except it should be dialed in such that it is formulaic and it doesn't, therefore allow uh, changes as easily as other forms of cooking do, when we follow a recipe. And when it comes to baking, that's a whole different thing, different discussion, if you need to or want to make changes, and certainly some testing of the recipe and modifications to, that formula will be necessary. Okay. So Afko, I hope, this brief conversation gives you a broader understanding of what you're up against and also the confidence to go into the kitchen with a new recipe and exert as much control as you can over it as you get to the finished product. But knowing that next time you'll be able to do it much better. Now, of course, if along the way you find that, oh, this clearly isn't a good idea according to the original recipe, make that change and make those corrections so that you can create a product that is going to be delicious, if not certainly good, and something that you can enjoy for your next meal. Thank you. Next up from Linda. When batch preparing vegetables for the week, how do I keep vegetables from getting soggy and spoiling? Slimy vegetables are so gross. I agree. We don't want to be dealing with spoiled product. And therefore, this idea of batch prepping ingredients for a period of time needs to be adjusted for your particular situation. And here we have some variables to contend with. One would be the product that we're working with, and it could be the variety that dictates a longer or shorter shelf life. It could be the quality of the product when it comes in our door from the grocery store or the farmer's market or wherever you source your product. And also our storage conditions. We might hold things in the refrigerator, for example, but the more you open and close your refrigerator, the more it goes through these slight warming and cooling cycles. And all of that will affect the shelf stability of food that's already prepped and waiting to be cooked one day. So if you're finding that your prepped items don't last for a week, you need to make a change. And overall, my preference is to prep more than once a week in order to optimize the quality of those ingredients. Okay. And then as you move on and develop your knife skills in particular, I think you will find that your list of items that you prepare ahead of time will shorten because you will be able to pull out the whole item and break it down with ease and very, very quickly and start to use the freshest ingredients in your cooking. Now, that's not to say that all of your ingredients will therefore be done, from the raw state, as in the whole product state. But you're going to find the ideal items that will last for the type of cooking that you do during the next few days versus things that you can very quickly break down on your own while something is sweating, right? While the oven is preheating. You have these gaps of time that are created during the cooking process very often, not always, but when they do occur, then you can sneak in, the knife work on something that's part of that process. And you might not know where those gaps are going to arise and which things you can comfortably break down if you're new to the process of cooking. Okay, but with experience, you're going to figure out where your confidence lies. And when as your skills develop over time, again, you're going to be more proficient at managing this bigger project of cooking. Okay, so I hope that helps. The bottom line is, if your products don't last a full week, you need to make adjustments. So prepping more than once a week is going to be the quick answer. Thank you. And we've got next question from Sarah, who says, can you teach more about how to describe food? The FOK flavor and texture sheet helps, but I want to learn more about methods for this and what you're looking for when grading. Thanks. So yeah, let me respond to your question from the tail end, and that is what we're looking for when grading. And I'm going to start by saying that we're looking for your good effort, okay, and your engagement in the process. And for many, many people, right, this is a great question, Sarah, because this is something that most of our students bump up against, but it's not asked in this forum very often. So I thank you for bringing this up. We want to see your engagement in your effort, and we can tell most of the time, what that looks like based upon what you're submitting. And the goal here is to develop a language around food. And it's a language around shopping for food, as we talk about quality of ingredients. It's a language around the various cooking processes that go into meal preparation. And it's also a language around the finished product as we sit at the table and we share our thoughts on the meal that we're enjoying. And so don't worry too much about the grade that you may or may not get, okay? But rather focus on your learning, and the cooking is number one, right? But out of that really needs to come this language. And think about any field of study, whatever it is, right? It could be baseball, it could be playing the flute, it could be the medical field. Every discipline has its language. And so very simply, we're asking you to slowly or quickly, if you can or want to, develop that vocabulary and that ease of speaking. Okay, so certainly the list of flavors and textures and aromas that we provide is a starting point. And so start to bring those terms into your daily vocabulary, and use these terms with people as you go to the farmer's market, as you cook alongside somebody, as you share a meal with somebody. Try to practice using these terms so they become more natural and not so clunky. And again, this is just the starting point for any new endeavor. Okay. Now, in terms of deepening and broadening your language around food, I would suggest that you start to read critiques or commentary around restaurant experiences that are online, or by food editors, food writers for local restaurants. For example, there's also a whole field of food literature out there, if that might interest you, where you've got established writers that are taking a different approach to food. very often than simply describing a meal, but there will be embedded in this beautiful food literature scenes of meals that are very delicately described. And this is how we can learn how other people are doing this, and then we can mimic some of that and start to bring it under our own umbrella until it becomes comfortable and we have our own style. Okay. So, to teach you more about how to describe food is difficult right here. If you were a student of mine, face to face, we would go through a number of different drafts, and I would give you feedback and you'd go back and rewrite. And, we would go through this sort of a process of writing. So it's much more than simply the mechanics of writing, which maybe I could touch upon in a setting like this, how to write a sentence, again, from a mechanical standpoint. But when it comes to the nuances of writing, it really takes a lot of practice. And I will, ask you to sort of take in some of these thoughts that I just shared and practice using this language in with your words, your spoken word, as well as your written word. And focus on your learning, and don't worry too much about the grade that is going to come out of what you submit. We're here to give you some feedback to help you along that path through this process. If you knew it all at this point, you wouldn't have to be here. Okay, so I hope you enjoy the process. Thank you. Next question is from Misha. Hi. I was wondering, is there an upside or downside to using glass cutting board, or should I invest in a wooden board? I've been using a tempered glass cutting board for years. My quick response is that if you can find a cutting surface that is less hard on your knife, then the cutting edge of the knife will last longer. And this is where, I have concerns with very hard surfaces like glass or metal, which I see sometimes. And, I lean toward wood or plastic boards. There are many types of wood that are commonly used for cutting boards, and any of those are fine. There are also, many types of plastic or some number of plastics that are used for cutting boards. And really all of those are fine as well. It really comes down to your aesthetic and maybe other considerations that are going to be your individual decisions. But that's, the hardness of glass is my only concern relative to the cutting edge. Even simply cutting, through apples and pumpkins and zucchini over time will bring a dullness to the knife. And certainly if you are cutting on a hard surface, that'll hasten that process. So my recommendation is to consider a surface that is perhaps a little bit softer, in the form of wood or plastic. Thank you. Next up from Ellen. Thanks for sharing your expertise. You're welcome. And thank you for that feedback. My family makes homemade maple syrup. Can I substitute maple syrup for honey in recipes? Would it be a one-to-one replacement? The general response here is yes, you can, and the ratio would be 1-to-1 or something very close to that. Both of them are liquid sweeteners, and so the substitution is usually pretty easy, okay, in that respect. It becomes a little trickier if you're doing dry in place of a liquid sweetener. And in terms of the ratio of replacement, it really comes down to your preference, because honeys have different flavor profiles and therefore sweetness comes through in different ways sometimes. And maple syrup, in my experience anyway, can be very similar, right? Where there are some different flavor intensities and flavor can be perceived in slightly different ways. But maple syrup is pretty sweet and honey is pretty sweet. And therefore I'm saying as a place to start, use the 1-to-1 ratio, but feel free to really think about your end product. And if you want to make adjustments from there, feel free. Thank you. And next up, we have another question from Ellen. And Ellen writes, I find it difficult finding certain ingredients where I live, like date paste. How should I make the barbecue recipe from the course? Any substitute, double the tomato paste, or simply omit it? Okay, so when it comes to the fruit pastes, right, which is an example of a whole food sweetener, our recommendation is to make your own. So whether it's dates or blueberries or apricots or something else that you might be using, get your dried fruit and mix it with a minimum amount of water to get it to blend in whatever tool or equipment you're using. And then you've got date paste. Okay. And then from there, you can adjust the consistency by adding, more water and kind of move forward from there. Now, in terms of making substitutions to a recipe, you introduce a great topic. So I'll take a little tangent here and spend a brief moment in time talking about substitutes. And the first thing that comes to mind for me always is, if you don't have an ingredient, first of all, think of its function in that recipe. And an item could be used as a sweetener. It could lend sourness or saltiness, or it could, add structure. So there are, a number of different functions that an ingredient can have, and very often it's multiple functions at the same time. And so in the case of dates in a date paste, they lend sweetness, but they also add a certain flavor along with that sweetness. So you want to think about, how you can replace both of those aspects of that single ingredient. And often that requires more than one ingredient as your substitutions. Sometimes we can nail it with one, but sometimes it also requires more than one ingredient for our consideration. And in the case of something like dates, it's got this rich earthiness, these caramely sort of notes. And so you might, consider some sort of a brown sugar. If it's tomato products, then maybe it's going to be a caramelized tomato product where you're bringing out some of the sweetness and those rich earthy notes. It's not going to be exactly the same as dates, of course, but you want to start to mimic as much as you can the different facets of the complexity of flavor that dates provide you. Okay. So, tomatoes also add a lot of acidity. I typically don't get that from dates, at least not in an obvious way. Okay. So, you think about maybe combining more tomato paste with brown sugar, of any sort, whether it's Jaggery or Pinot Noir or something else from around the world. And then you say, can I simply omit it? Sure, you can always try a recipe by omitting an ingredient, so long as it's not one of the key ingredients that add structure or the main taste or significant flavor, because the recipe will fall apart at that point. So, keep that in mind. But otherwise, sure, you can try to omit something and just see how you like the end product. At the end of the day, you have license to make any changes you want to a recipe. It's just going to be up to you and your audience as to whether or not you like the finished product. But this is where a lot of learning takes place as well, right? When you make substitutions for whatever reasons, whether it's because you don't have the item, because you don't have enough of the item, because there is a health concern associated with the item. And so you make these changes, and you'll learn a lot about ingredients and about cooking in general. So, go forth and enjoy the process. Thank you. All right. We have another, or not another, but the next question is from Cindy, who writes, how do I cook eggs without oil? I've tried and they stick terribly. Aha. So this is a perennial question because by and large, there's not a great answer. Eggs tend to stick. And, if you have a pristine non-stick pan, you can make eggs and that non-sticky quality will last for a while, but it tends to go away because non-stick pans will start to accumulate what I call micro scratches. And I'm going to take a little tangent here again and talk about non-stick pans, and I'll come back to your question, okay, Joyce? Or Cindy, I'm sorry. And that is to say that when you buy pans, I recommend that you avoid a full set of non-stick pans because they do accumulate scratches over time and the non-stick quality diminishes. And therefore, I consider non-stick pans to be a disposable item in my toolkit. And I'll have one, maybe two, but the rest of them will be just something else that will last the rest of my life, whether it's stainless steel or cast iron or something else. Coming back to Cindy's question here about cooking eggs without oil, it's a challenge. And, you might try a different cooking method than the fried egg in a pan method. So a different method would be one in water, and poached eggs would be the closest that would sort of mimic the look and mouthfeel of a fried egg. There's of course the eggs that are cooked in the shell, and you can do a soft cooked egg, but that's a different end result, and it might not be really what you want for one reason or another. There are certainly folks that I bump up against once in a while that will say that their cast iron pan has such a layer of seasoning built up that they can cook eggs without the addition of oil. But in order to get there, you need to use oil in order to build up that finish. So again, coming back to the core question here, I don't know of a consistent method for cooking fried eggs without oil. So this is where perhaps a compromise is in order, where you use, say, a non-stick pan with minimal oil to get the results that you want. Totally up to you, of course, but just think about the fluidity and flexibility of cooking, and versus how rigid you want to be in your approach to cooking. Okay, the alternative, of course, is to simply stop cooking fried eggs and then find like I mentioned, a different cooking method, whether it's poaching or something else. Thank you. Okay, now to Joyce's question. What's the easiest way to peel a hard squash like butternut or pumpkin? Well, this is another great question. I will share a couple of thoughts that come to mind. And the first also involves a safety consideration. I don't, I want to avoid any cuts. So generally, I try to cut the item in half, place that cut side down so it's stable. So that's the safety concern that's checked off my list. So then I can get a knife and I can make slices around the edge as I rotate the squash to remove that hard skin or hard peel. Keep in mind also that as you're working with these very dense, these hard products, like pumpkins, that a thin bladed knife risks chipping. Okay, and I've seen this a number of times. So do keep this in mind. I recommend using a heavier knife when working with ingredients like this. Okay. Now, the other thing that comes to mind is that, especially with items, squash that have an irregular surface, the method that I just mentioned works well for me. For squash that have a smooth surface like butternut, a peeler can work well. And I have a peeler that works very well on butternut squash. It just follows the smooth, contours of the squash, and there's minimal loss of flesh as well. And so, that's a very nice way to do that. But for other things, I will use a knife. So please consider those two methods, keeping in mind safety as well. Thank you. Hi, Barbara. Next question from Barbara says, what is the best way to store flowers so they stay fresh longer? In the FOK recipes, there are several different types of flour. So generally, a cooler temperature is going to bring more stability to the flour, especially if it's a whole grain flour, which has more of the fats and items that are susceptible to spoilage. So again, whole grain flours will have relatively shorter shelf lives than their refined counterparts. So if you have a cool place, whether it's downstairs or in the refrigerator or someplace else, consider those places for the longest shelf life, the greatest shelf stability. The other thing to keep in mind is consider smaller pack sizes, and to help you work through that quantity before it has a chance of going rancid or spoiling. Okay, here at home, we'll buy masa harina in a 50-pound bag because we really like tortillas. But there are some other things that we'll buy in more reasonable 5 or 10-pound packages. So, just think about your usage rate versus your storage conditions and choose, appropriately. And you can always try to look for these items in the bulk section of some grocery stores, in which case you can buy whatever quantity you want. I hope you'll consider all of that. Thank you. Next question is from Julie, who writes, I press out liquid, marinate, and air fry or skillet toast tofu and mung dal, but it's sticky in the skillet. Any suggestions? So if we're talking about tofu steaks, for example, here I would consider some oil. Tofu does have a tendency to stick when that pan gets hot. That's just the nature of that item. And beans generally do. And so mung dal would fall into this category as well. I would recommend trying out a non-stick pan. I've had great success cooking tofu steaks, as well as bean patties in a non-stick pan or some sort of a non-stick surface. You can sometimes find these larger electric skillets. A lot of times they're marketed for breakfast cookery, but they work very well for this sort of a food item as well. So, I hope you'll consider those two things: a non-stick surface, little bit of oil, maybe one or the other or both will give you the results I think that you're looking for. Thank you. And next up from Sylvia, let's see here. Okay, I'm going to actually take Tony, who just jumped in here. And Tony writes, how long does homemade fruit paste last? So we have a shelf life question here. Great question. And my answer always is, well, it depends. Okay. And so, generally leftover foods and something that's processed is going to fall into this leftover category. It's processed, it's been handled. And so it's something different from the original date. So I'm going to call it a processed or leftover food. All of these things generally last about a week. but a week could really mean, give or take a couple of days, depending on what it is. And it could be a lot shorter than that or a lot longer than that, depending on what it is. And it also depends on the storage conditions. And so, as I mentioned, earlier in today's program, the more you open and close a refrigerator, the more warm air enters and the temperature goes up and down. The shelf stability of an item is compromised. Also, if you place an item in the door of the refrigerator, that tends to be the warmest location, right? Versus the back of the refrigerator, which tends to be the coldest. So up front, if the item is not super stable to start with, it's going to have a compromised shelf life. But looking at something like a fruit paste, if it is indeed in a pasty form with relatively low water content, it's going to have a longer shelf life. The higher the water content, the greater the opportunity for bacteria and mold to multiply, and therefore the shorter the shelf life. So there are a lot of variables here to consider, Tony. And the best thing is to keep the 1 week guideline in mind and make as much as you're going to use within that period of time. Otherwise, you do risk this decline in quality. Now, an alternative, of course, is to hold things in the freezer. And the freezer is a great tool or piece of equipment if we can use it strategically. And that means that the item should take a round trip, right, into the freezer and then back out again so that we can use it at some point. And I say this because from my own experience, where certain things will take a one-way trip to the freezer and they get lost and overlooked, and all of a sudden they're freezer burnt or dried out in some way and really not fit for consumption. And so label things, date them, put them in the freezer, and check back on it periodically so that you can use it within a couple of weeks or a couple of months or so, while the quality of that food item is still good. Okay, so Tony, a lot of things to consider, but I hope you can keep those in mind as you manage not just fruit paste, but all the other things in your inventory. Thank you. All right, Sylvia writes, if salad lettuce has brown spots, is that a sign that food is not being refrigerated correctly at the restaurant or store? At home, it takes a long time for the fresh lettuce to show brown spots. The quick answer is yes. And some things will develop brown spots because they've been sitting around for a long time. And other things will develop brown spots because they've been stored at the incorrect temperature, whether that's a high temperature or even a low temperature. Okay, that can cause premature breakdown of products. So the quick answer is yes, it's incorrect storage, but it can be due to a couple of different things: time, right, or temperature. Thank you. And next up from Melissa. Can you help with a little clarity on purchasing flour for making bread? The all-purpose flour protein count seems low at 4 to 6%, even in high-quality brands. So 4 to 6% protein in all-purpose flour seems low to me. Usually that's going to be in the range of, say, 9 to 11%. There may be some outliers, but that's probably a pretty common window for all-purpose flour. Yeah, I mean, if you want to reach out to me at support@rouxbe.com, Melissa, and provide some details from the label, including the brand name and even a snapshot of the label showing protein content, or in the label on the front itself. I'm just curious what this brand is and what this all-purpose flour is that's at such a low protein content. That's unusual to me. Okay. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit, but it certainly doesn't answer it raises more questions for me. Maybe it does for you too, Melissa. But anyway, I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you. Next up from Teresa. When making a vegetable broth simmering for 60 to 90 minutes, the carrots are still pretty firm and flavorful, not spent. Should I simmer longer or chop smaller? Ah, okay. So you've got the answers right there. You bet. If you want to extract more flavor, certainly simmer longer. You can also create more surface area by cutting smaller and therefore extracting more flavor faster. And a third option would be that you can always use that product that still has flavor in it in something else. In other words, if you have made vegetable stock that is satisfactory to your end goal, and you have this mirepoix that's left over, then consider using that in something else, a different stew or soup, or in vegetable patties, or something else that might come to mind. Thank you. And another question from Misha. What can I substitute on bread to substitute, in place of butter on toast or mayo on bread for sandwiches? I'm new to the whole food plant-based diet. So think about other purees that might be, in your kitchen or come to mind, including a mash of avocado. It could be hummus. It could be red bell pepper puree that could be reduced a little bit to thicken it up a little bit. And it could be pesto. It might be tapenade, which is made from olives. It's at this point, it's going to be a spread made from olives. So those are a few items that you can use in place of mayonnaise, for example, or butter. Okay, and I'm sure that other things will come to mind. Let me also put in a plug for miso paste. I will use that on toast from time to time. Miso paste tastes very nice. Thank you. And another question from Sylvia, who says, do you have any tips on roasting Brussels sprouts so that they come out firm but crisp and cooked all the way through? Thanks. Yes, this is going to be, cooking is fundamentally a balance of time and temperature. So, I'm not sure where you're starting out with, and maybe that's not really so important that I know exactly the numbers, but think about usually increasing the oven temperature. So, and I'm thinking about flavor development through browning. And if you cut those Brussels sprouts in half and you place the cut side down for maximum contact on your sheet pan, then you're going to have maximum heat transfer. So the cooking is going to take place as quickly as it can. And let's see, you can develop some crispness on the outside through that intense heat in that box, aka the oven. And you can then, it's going to be up to you to taste it, to poke at it, to find when the inside, that internal doneness, is where you want it in terms of its firmness. Okay. Let me also add that at home, this is going to be when using a gas oven, okay, where the very bottom of the oven, in other words, underneath your racks, on the floor of the oven, it's a smooth floor. Electric ovens will usually have an electric element, a heating element on the bottom. But if you have a gas oven, what I will do is get my sheet pan of vegetables and put it directly on the floor of the oven where it's intensely hot. And that will develop this great color, this great browning on those vegetables. And, the oven temp might be at 420 degrees or something like that. So you might give that a try as well, as you find this balance between time and temperature that suits your palate. Thank you. And the next question is from Sue, who says, can you eat kale and spinach and not worry about oxalates? They are both green light foods, but they are both high in oxalates. So this is really going to be an individual concern. There are certainly a lot of folks that will eat kale and spinach in its raw form. You know, you cut it into a chiffonade, you put that into a salad, and it tastes great, and it doesn't bother a lot of people. But if you find that oxalates bother you, then I recommend avoiding the raw consumption of these food products. But otherwise, that's going to be an individual concern, an individual decision. Thank you. And our final question of the day is another question from Tony, who says, can I take a very old cast iron that has been passed down somewhere to save it? It has burnt spots underneath and it's starting to rust, but I don't want to get rid of it. Absolutely. Yeah, this is one of the beauties of cast iron cook surface, cast iron cookware, is that you can sand it down and bring it down to its clean metal, and then re-season it and just start all over, essentially with a new cooking surface at that point. And so you'll want to coat it in oil, the inside and outside, and then put it into the oven at a high temperature. And I would recommend the highest temperature, and it's probably going to be around 550 degrees or so. Turn on your fans, open up all the doors and the windows, because it'll produce some smoke, because what you're doing is you're bringing the oils up to a temperature where they start to polymerize, and the molecular structure of the oil changes in a way that will create this plastic-like, very hard structure and surface on the pan. But it does require a pretty high temperature, and you can do this multiple times. So oil it, bake it, let it cool down, oil it, bake it, and do this 3 or 4 or 5 times, and to build up this layer of polymerized oil. And this is the seasoning process, and then in terms of caring for it, just avoid scrubbing it after cooking. It should be soaked to loosen up anything that sticks to it, and then just gently clean it out. Because really what you want to do is to continue, right, the buildup of the oils on the pan, whether it's the inside or even the outside is fine. And you should be quite fine, using this moving forward. And if you ever find in the future that for whatever reason, right, you've developed some little spots, maybe someone did scrub the pan and scrubbed through the layer of seasoning that you've built up, you can always redo this process. So I hope you'll enjoy the process of seasoning your pan. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. This brings to conclusion today's program, and I'll look for you again. And in the meantime, I wish you all happy cooking. Thank you.